You're locked in a stone cell beneath the greatest arena ever built. Above you, 50,000 Romans just watched your husband die fighting a lion. The crowd is leaving. The torches are dimming. Then you hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer. A shadow fills your doorway. It's the gladiator who survived today's massacre. He's covered in blood that isn't his own. A guard unlocks your cell. The gladiator points at you. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This was reality in the Roman Empire. What I'm about to show you is the part of Roman history they don't teach in schools. The systematic, state-sponsored nightmare that happened after the crowds went home. This isn't speculation. It's documented by Roman writers themselves, and the evidence is literally carved into the walls beneath the Colosseum. Hollywood has been lying to you about gladiators for decades. Films show you the blood and combat, the honor and rebellion. What they don't show you is what happened in the hours after the games ended, when the public spectacle transformed into something far more sinister. I'm talking about a system so disturbing that modern historians struggle to describe it adequately. The Romans themselves never called it remarkable, because to them it wasn't. It was just normal. Here's what we know for certain. Roman writers like Martial, Juvenal, and Seneca documented a world where conquered women were warehoused beneath arenas and distributed as prizes. Not metaphorically. Literally handed out like rations to gladiators who performed well. The Roman state, the government itself, operated this system with the same bureaucratic efficiency they used to build aqueducts and roads. Think about that. The same civilization that gave us concrete and representative government also perfected the industrialization of systematic violence. To understand what happened in those underground chambers, you first need to understand how Rome turned human beings into inventory. This wasn't random cruelty. This was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale, and it started the moment Roman legions conquered new territory. When Rome crushed a rebellion in Gaul or annihilated a city in Judea, they didn't just win a battle. They processed an entire population like a factory assembly line for human suffering. Men of military age were sent to die in mines or arenas. Children were sold to slave markets across the empire. Women were designated as captiva, war prizes belonging to the state. Here's where it gets truly chilling. Under Roman law, these people weren't legally human anymore. They were classified as res, things, property, the same legal category as furniture or livestock. A conquered woman had no more rights than a chair. You could do anything to her, and it wasn't even technically a crime, because you can't commit a crime against an object. But Rome didn't just dehumanize people through law. They dehumanized them through spectacle. The games weren't just entertainment. They were political theater, designed to psychologically dominate both the conquered and Rome's own citizens. When you watched a captured Germanic chieftain fight a lion, you weren't just seeing a man die. You were watching Rome demonstrate what happens to anyone who defies the empire. And during the midday lull, when the elite left for lunch, that's when things got truly sadistic. Historians call these fatal charades, mythological reenactments, where condemned prisoners were forced to act out famous myths, except the deaths were real. The poet Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes these scenes with disturbing casualness. He writes about a prisoner dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician. They led him into the arena with a lyre, then released a bear. Martial notes, almost disappointed, that this time the music didn't work as the bear mauled the man to death while 50,000 people ate honeyed dates. In another passage, Martial describes a woman forced to reenact a myth involving a sacred bull. For this prisoner, it meant being publicly assaulted by an animal in front of thousands of spectators until she died from her injuries. The Roman state designed a system where human beings were killed by animals as lunchtime entertainment. This wasn't the sick fantasy of one mad emperor. This was decades of standard operating procedure. Senators brought their children to watch. The events were advertised on walls throughout the city. Vendors sold snacks. Martial himself notes that, whatever myth tells us, the arena makes real. He's writing this as a compliment. He's praising the efficiency of the system. This was the environment, this industrialized bureaucratic machinery of cruelty that also processed conquered women into the reward system for gladiators. Now let's talk about the men who received these rewards. Gladiators existed in a bizarre contradiction that Rome never fully resolved. They were simultaneously the lowest and highest members of society, slaves with less legal status than a dog, but celebrities whose faces appeared on mosaics and whose names were graffitied on walls by adoring fans. Women of the aristocracy were obsessed with them. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii calls one gladiator the sigh of the girls and another the glory of the ladies. There are documented cases of noble women sneaking into gladiator barracks, paying off guards for private encounters. Even stranger, their bodily fluids were commodified. Gladiator sweat was collected after fights, mixed with olive oil, and sold as an aphrodisiac and beauty treatment. But Rome lived in constant terror of these men. The Spartacus rebellion, which happened in 73 BC, was burned into Roman cultural memory. 78 gladiators had escaped, raised an army of 70,000, and nearly brought Rome to its knees. When Rome finally crushed them, they crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way. One body every 40 meters for 200 kilometers. The trauma never left the Roman psyche. Every time a gladiator picked up a sword, they all remembered that these men had once come terrifyingly close to burning Rome to the ground. So how do you control incredibly dangerous, incredibly valuable men who have legitimate grievances and the combat skills to act on them? You use a combination of brutal punishment and calculated rewards. Extra food rations, prize money, freedom after enough victories. But the sources hint at something else. Access to conquered women. The documentation here is frustratingly scattered. Roman writers mention it in passing, like it's too obvious to explain in detail. But when you piece together references from Martial, Juvenal, and later sources, a pattern emerges. After a particularly impressive victory, gladiators who survived and fought well were given what ancient sources vaguely refer to as privileges of the victor. Modern historians believe this often meant access to female captives held beneath the arena. The process appears to have been chillingly bureaucratic. The gladiator would be brought down into the hypogeum, the vast underground network beneath the arena floor, still wearing his armor, still covered in blood and sand. A ludus official would act as an escort. They'd walk through tunnels lit by oil lamps, past animal cages and mechanical lifts, until they reached a specific section of holding cells. These weren't general prison cells. Archaeological evidence from various amphitheaters across the empire reveals small chambers with distinctive features. Stone benches. Iron rings anchored into walls at waist height and near the floor. Doors that lock from the outside. Some rooms show evidence of chains permanently mounted to the architecture. The women held in these cells were called captivae damnatae, condemned war captives. They'd already been processed through Rome's bureaucracy of conquest. Each woman was assigned a number and a category based on her origin. Germanica, Britannica, Parthica. The gladiator would be shown a row of cells. Some accounts suggest he could choose. Others imply women were simply assigned, like equipment being checked out of a warehouse. Either way, a guard would unlock the designated cell. What happened next isn't described in explicit detail in surviving sources, but the architecture tells the story the texts won't. Here's what makes this especially sinister. This wasn't a crime. It wasn't even viewed as morally questionable by most Romans. This was part of the operational budget of the games. The logistics were handled by the same administrators who scheduled animal fights and maintained arena equipment. From the state's perspective, this system solved multiple problems elegantly. It rewarded loyal gladiators cheaply. Conquered women cost the state nothing. It reinforced the gladiator's sense of power without actually giving him any real freedom. And it sent a message. This is what Roman dominance means. One Roman writer put it bluntly. The victor claims his prize in the same manner the empire claims its provinces, by right of conquest. Let's talk about the physical spaces where this happened, because the archaeology is damning. When archaeologists first excavated beneath the Colosseum in the 19th century, they were primarily interested in the impressive engineering. But as excavations continued, they found something they didn't expect. Specialized chambers that served no obvious logistical purpose. These rooms are small, typically 10 to 15 square meters. They're located in a separate section of the hypogeum, away from animal cages and gladiator ready rooms. Stone benches line the walls at a specific height. Iron rings are anchored into the walls at multiple heights. The doors are heavy wood, reinforced with iron, and they lock from the outside. The walls in several chambers show evidence of scratching, desperate fingernails trying to dig through solid stone. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century AD, mentions that beneath major amphitheaters were chambers for those awaiting their use. But the most disturbing evidence comes from graffiti. In the hypogeum beneath the amphitheater in Capua, archaeologists found scratch marks on cell walls. Some are in Latin, others in languages from across the empire. One, written in crude Latin by someone clearly not a native speaker, translates roughly to, "I was Aemilia of the Brigantes. I saw my children killed. Now I am nothing." Another, in what appears to be Celtic, has been translated as, "To any god who listens, let me die before tomorrow." These aren't the voices history typically preserves. Roman chronicles name emperors and generals. They don't record the names of conquered women catalogued as property. But the stones remember. The architecture itself tells us something crucial. This system was designed for efficiency and repetition. These weren't improvised locations. They were purpose-built, maintained facilities. Compare this to how Rome handled other aspects of gladiatorial management, and the pattern becomes clear. Every element of the arena infrastructure was carefully planned and standardized across the empire. These chambers fit the same pattern. This was state-sponsored infrastructure for systematic abuse. Now we have to confront the hardest part of this story, what this actually meant for the women trapped in this system. History is almost completely silent on their individual experiences. We don't have diaries. We don't have testimony. What we have are ledgers that list them as numbers and property inventories that describe them like livestock. But we can reconstruct the nightmare from what we know about the conquest process. When Rome conquered a region that resisted, the aftermath was methodical. Men of fighting age were killed or enslaved for hard labor. Children were separated and sold to slave markets. Women of childbearing age were designated as captiva and transported in chains to holding facilities. For a woman in this situation, the journey to the arena was already a descent through hell. You'd watched your village burn. You'd seen your children torn from your arms, screaming. You'd been chained to dozens of other women and marched hundreds of miles to Rome. You'd been examined like livestock, assigned a number, and locked in a cell beneath the monument to the civilization that destroyed everything you knew. The waiting was its own form of torture. You could hear everything, the roar of the crowd above, the screams of animals being slaughtered, the cheers when a gladiator delivered a killing blow. And you knew you'd never leave. There was no ransom system, no prisoner exchange. Rome didn't negotiate with the conquered. You'd simply disappear into the machinery of empire. Then came the footsteps. The cell door opening. The door closing and locking again, with you on the wrong side of it. Roman law provided no protection. You couldn't appeal to magistrates because legally you weren't a person. This was psychological warfare on a civilizational scale. The humiliation of conquered women wasn't a side effect of Roman military policy. It was a deliberate strategy. The goal was to break the spirit of resistance so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even dare to think about defying Rome. After crushing the Jewish revolt in 70 AD, the historian Josephus records that Romans deliberately took Jewish women to be distributed among the legions and the games specifically to demonstrate that they'd lost any ability to protect their families. The message was clear: resist Rome, and this is what happens to your daughters. Occasionally, this system broke in unexpected ways. On extremely rare occasions, women fought in the arena itself. Some were slaves forced to fight, but others appear to have been noble women who saw the arena as a perverse form of power. The very existence of female gladiators scandalized Rome's elite. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus attended games in Antioch that featured female fighters. According to historian Cassius Dio, the Roman spectators jeered, shouted sexual comments, and treated the entire event as an obscene joke. Severus was reportedly mortified, not by the violence itself, but by how crudely his fellow Romans reacted. So he banned women from fighting in the arena entirely. Think about what this tells us. The problem wasn't protecting women from violence. Female captives were still being held in chambers beneath the arena. The problem was that the violence had become too visible in a way that made Rome's self-image uncomfortable. The emperor was fine with the abuse. He just wanted it to happen in the shadows where it belonged. Here's what should truly disturb you. This system didn't end with some moral awakening. The games continued for centuries. Even after Rome officially converted to Christianity in the 4th century AD, the gladiatorial games persisted for decades. The last recorded gladiatorial combat happened in 404 AD, when a monk named Telemachus jumped into the arena to stop a fight and was torn apart by an outraged crowd. But even that didn't end the system of captivity beneath the arenas. The infrastructure remained. The system eventually faded not because of moral progress, but because the Roman Empire itself collapsed. The machinery of conquest stopped, so the supply of captives dried up. The institution died from lack of resources, not from ethical evolution. Today, when tourists visit the Colosseum, they take selfies in front of magnificent arches and marvel at ancient engineering. The tour guides talk about gladiatorial combat and animal hunts. Most never mention what happened in the chambers below. The stones are still there. Those rings bolted into the walls haven't rusted away. The scratch marks from desperate fingernails are still preserved beneath centuries of dust. We're not talking about a few isolated incidents. This was policy. This was infrastructure. This was normal. The Colosseum stands as a monument to what empire actually means. Not just the grand architecture and military victories we celebrate, but the industrialized horror required to maintain absolute power. The spectacle on the sand was only the half of it that Rome wanted you to see. The other half happened in those chambers beneath your feet, in the moments after the crowd's roar faded into silence. Those voices, the ones that weren't supposed to be preserved, are still there in those walls if you're willing to listen. And that's the story they don't teach in history class. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Share this video with those who love history. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video.